taxes tend to shrink, especially given that our biggest source of tax revenue is corporate taxes. So corporate profits coming down means taxes also come down. So as taxes came down, we also saw the spending by the government increase, partly because a fair amount of spending is on subsidies, and at times that, for example, the world oil price goes up or remains high, these subsidies also increase. So spending up, revenues down, government fiscal deficit expanding, that was yet another. So falling growth, government deficit expanding, two big problems. And a third big problem was that households, seeing high rates of inflation, decided to invest in assets which were more inflation immune, more specifically housing and gold. And what you saw was a substantial expansion in gold imports last year, as well as this year. And you put those two together, and you get, along with government saving, and you get a rising current account deficit. So, slow growth, rising fiscal deficit, rising current account deficit. So not only does the government need to borrow more, but the country needs to borrow more from outside. And to complete the picture, of course, high inflation, which the Reserve Bank has with high interest rates, has had some success in keeping non-food inflation, non-food manufacturing inflation down. In fact, core inflation is now on a month-to-month basis at about 2%, which is extremely good news going forward. The problem is food inflation is still very high and keeping up the consumer price indices, even though the wholesale price indices have come down. So why am I saying all this? Just to say that going into this budget, in fact, going into September last year, we were in a very tight macroeconomic situation. And the first order of business was to rectify that. And in this rectification process, I think a number of objectives had to be met by the budget. The first is that we have to revive growth. A lot of the actions lie outside the budget, but some lie inside the budget. But the important task of the budget is to rebalance national spending away from consumption to investment. And to the extent that the budget fuels government consumption, we need to back away from that, reduce the extent of government dis-saving. One of the big things that we had to do before the budget and continuing into the future is to reduce the extent of distortionary that the government spends money on. Second important task for the government and the budget is to increase opportunities for savers to get substantial real returns on financial investments, so that not only they're, but also they dissuaded going into assets like gold as an alternative, which hits us on a number of fronts. Third, part of the growth process is to remove bottlenecks to investment and to improve job creation. Again, a number of actions have been taken outside the budget, such as the Cabinet Committee on Investment, but the budget can also provide targeted incentives. Targeted because we don't have that much money to improve some of these things. And finally, fourth, we have to reduce the cost to borrowers of raising financing so that they can go out and invest that money in projects. So these are a bunch of objectives that the budget can help on. An objective that the budget can help indirectly on is to combat inflation. The RBI is centrally engaged in that task, but the budget can also help by reducing the excess spending, reducing the excess demand, and reorienting consumption towards investment. So to see why deficit reduction was the highest priority objective, see all the good things it can do. It can reduce consumption demand, as I just said, giving the RBI more room to cut interest rates and then move our spending more towards investment in that process. It increases national savings, thus indirectly helping reduce the current account deficit, which is really the difference between national investment and national savings. If we increase our national savings, we reduce the extent to which we rely on foreign investors. It also reduces the government's borrowing, allowing the private sector more room to borrow. And perhaps most important, confidence about the stability of government finances going forward gives everyone, domestic investors, foreign investors, the confidence to continue financing both the government and the country. Now, you can cut government deficits in different ways, as you well know. You can increase revenues, that is, raise taxes, or you can cut spending. The problem with raising taxes is that it hurts economic activity, especially investment, and at this time that is the last thing we want to do. Cutting government spending is also damaging to economic activity, as the growth austerity debate that you see in the West suggests. But in situations like ours, it is sometimes the lesser of two evils. And to the extent that in cutting cut distortionary subsidies, we can actually both and the quality of growth. Let me give you one example. We subsidize diesel and we subsidize electricity, in fact, to the point that it's free in some states. Now, in the north of India, rich farmers run their pumps all day, irrigating their fields by drawing water out of deep artesian wells, growing deeper by the day as water is depleted. So the water table depletes, we irrigate fields, and typically larger farmers with bigger pumps can reach the water table while the smaller farmers can't. So the smaller farmers see their crops wither or do not so well, even while the larger farmers use that scarce water to produce rice. And so the water poor north exports rice, which essentially is water. I mean, most agricultural economists will say when you export rice, you're exporting water. We're exporting water when we are actually water scarce. So subsidies here, as you can see, make us produce the wrong crop, increases income inequality, and essentially depletes our agricultural future. This is one of those subsidies, subsidies to power, subsidies to diesel, which, if reduced at least on this dimension, will actually help improve growth, the quality of growth, and reduce income inequality. It would help on many fronts. So we have taken some actions on subsidies before the budget. We have raised diesel prices. We have allowed oil marketing companies to continue raising them regularly. We've also given raised power tariffs as a condition for helping them restructure the debts of their distribution companies. I'm not saying we've reached the end of the road on subsidies. We are. Even as I speak, there is discussion in government circles on the need to bring the fertilizer subsidy down. And perhaps if we were to want to immunize the budget against changes in oil prices, we should think about freezing the extent of the diesel subsidy. That's something that we ought to consider. But the point I want to get to is the big idea in the budget, which may seem like one into it, is to contain a variety of spending so that the budget deficit is brought under control, down from look like hitting to the 5.2% that the government will hit this year, and the 4.8% that's targeted for the coming fiscal year. Now, in making these cuts, there is a certain amount of confusion amongst analysts, which is why we get all sorts of claims that we haven't cut spending. There are two parts of government spending. One is called non-planned spending, which is things like government salaries. And the other is planned spending, which is part of the various plans that are in place, various programs that the government has announced over time. Now, people tend to see the difference between these two as spending is current consumption by the government, planned spending is long-term investment. It's not quite that. Over time, the difference between the two has got blurred. So a lot of planned spending is really spending on a variety of government programs, some of which entail current consumption. So if you want to cut spending, non-planned spending is very hard to cut because a lot of the items are already fixed by various laws, by various commitments. So you really got to hit at planned spending, but within planned spending you have to be judicious and cut the parts, cut the fat, so to speak, rather than cut the muscle. And in 2012, as soon as saw that we were in danger of exceeding the budget target significant amount, starting in August, September, started taking actions to start reining in spending. The hit went to planned spending, in part because planned spending itself had been increased tremendously according to the budget for the year. So there was a lot of increase that was budgeted. There was a feeling that the government would not be able to spend all of it well and carefully, and therefore we could cut. But we could cut without cutting into muscle, but cutting the fat. And as a result, when you look at the budgetary numbers for this year, we've cut planned spending a tremendous amount and therefore made the numbers. There has been a real cut in spending. And given that we've shrunk budgeted the spending on planned expenditure this year, we could increase the spending for next year and still achieve fiscal targets. So when the analysts look at the numbers which reflect the increase, they say, oh, the government hasn't really cut spending. Well, it has, because it cut this year and therefore could still manage an increase next year and at the same time not exceed its budgetary targets. Now, of course, a lot of commentators worry about what might happen over the next year, which is an election year, and whether we will start spending again in a big way. It's hard for me to predict what will happen as a result of elections, but what I do want to emphasize is the finance minister has said repeatedly that he aims to hit the 4.8% deficit target without bells and whistles, that if we look like we are exceeding that target, there are measures that he can take and will take in order to meet it. So that's in some sense, that kind of statement should carry some credibility, especially given what he has done this year, relative to where a lot of analysts did not believe that we would bring the budget in at below 5.3, and it's only in recent weeks that they have come to believe that it will be possible. I think they should have the same level of credibility for next year. The second big sort of concern in the budget is that we have increased taxes on people while we haven't cut spending. Again, I told you we have cut spending substantially, but as far as taxes go, the entire additional revenue raising this year is 0.2% of GDP, 0.2 percentage points of GDP, around 20,000 crores, which is really a minuscule portion of the budget. It has been, in a sense, blown up as, for example, this what is termed the tax on the super rich. First, this is a temporary tax. It's a small tax. The so-called rich, I don't want to call them the super rich, in this country are taxed at much lower rates than, for example, in any European country or even the United States. But the tax, to be vindictive in any way, it was merely an attempt to raise revenues a little in a time of difficulty, and it is meant to be temporary, and hopefully it will be a temporary tax. The whole intent behind the budget was to stay with a framework which people have gotten used to, which is 3 slabs taxed at 10, 20, 30, and not change the fundamental structure of the taxation regime to create some credibility for that. Let me come finally to the first big idea in the budget was deficit containment, but there is a second big idea in the budget, which is rather than the government being the source of new additional activity, can we give nudges, enabling nudges, rather than forceful pushes, which require moderate amounts of money, but also can create, a much bigger wave because it energizes different forces, especially in the private sector. For example, we recognize we need more investment. it would be silly for the government to start now thinking about major investment plans. Those will take 5, 10 years. By the time we put them in place, the economy will be way back on track. What we need to do is nudge investment by the private sector forward, make them bring their plans forward and put stuff into the ground. And so we have an investment allowance which gives them credit, a tax credit effectively, if they put their investment over the next couple of years. So that's one example. Another example is a lot of small and medium enterprises stay small, even many years after starting up. This is in contrast to other countries where small and medium enterprises grow and create jobs. Part of the problem is in India we have two disincentives to growth for small and medium enterprises. So what we're trying to do is create some incentive for them to grow out of all the benefits that they have. So one of the proposals in the budget is to continue allowing them to have benefits that they got when they were small for 3 years after they grow out of the category of being small. So that by the time they turn around and say, we've spent 3 years a little bigger and gotten these benefits, they enjoy the benefits of being large. At that point, they don't want to turn back and become small again to enjoy some of the benefits of that they get being small. Finally, a big thrust in this budget is expanding access to financing so that the private sector can get the money, the public sector firms also, and do what they need to do. Access to financing is what we've been working on, access to domestic financing, access to foreign financing, number of measures in the budget trying to reduce the barriers for foreign investors to come into India, to bring their money in and to invest it. And this is an ongoing process. As the finance minister mentioned on Monday, we are going to continue working on this. Don't think the budget is the end of it. If you didn't see some of the improvements that some people have been asking for or looking for, all these issues are being considered and is to make it easy in India over the coming years. So there was some unfortunate misapprehension about Mauritius and tax treaties and so on. I think the misapprehension has been cleared, but the broader point is India intends to be friendly to foreign investors and not change the rules of the game on them. Another final point before I get to I open up for questions is that we also I said one of the reasons we haven't raised taxes in this period of difficulty is we want to keep the tax regime relatively stable. But also, I think one of the important messages we want to send is more Indians have to pay taxes. That is, we have to broaden the tax base rather than levy more and more taxes on those honest enough to pay them today. So 2 or 3 measures that will emerge. One, of course, is we're using the information we already have on taxpayers, on non-taxpayers and their purchases to tell them in a friendly way, look, you've just bought a really expensive car. Unless you have taxable income, it's hard to see how you could afford it. Why don't you look up your records and see if you owe some taxes? Those kinds of letters are being sent out. The idea is more broadly that we hope that we will improve the tax base. One big factor in doing this is the goods and services tax, which is an attempt to improve the taxation by clubbing a bunch of taxes together, creating an all-India market, but also bringing more people into the tax net. It is something we're working on very hard, and hopefully, with the assent of the states, is something that can happen over the next year. But again, that requires the cooperation of the states. Is something we need to do. So, to end, I mean, the big sort of attempts in the budget were first, narrow the fiscal deficit, second, create targeted incentives to improve investment and also to increase the ease of financing. This is not to say India doesn't need big reforms. I mean, people were looking, if you want to look for big reforms, I can reel off 5 or 6 we need to do. We have 100 million tons of coal being imported every year, despite having some of the largest coal reserves in the world. Why is it that we are importing so much coal? We produce too much wheat and too few pulses. We have some of the most stringent labor laws in the world, even as we are one of the countries with the greatest fraction of unprotected workers. And we do, as China is giving up on some industries, or some industries are departing China because it's too expensive, we need to attract more of them into India rather than see them go elsewhere. There are many things we need to do, but also there are many sources of opportunity in India, and we are certainly next to China one of the fastest growing large countries in the world. But in the coming years, there are massive new opportunities which are going to emerge in India. For example, the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, which is being contemplated, $90 billion of investment over the next 4 years, is a massive project which will create 8 new cities, major ports, new airports, but also hopefully, and this is my hope, that we will ease the way for manufacturing by both creating infrastructure but also reducing the regulation on small, medium, and large enterprises, and we'll create great new industrial cities which will make India more of a manufacturing hub in the world. So India has problems, but what I want you to understand is we understand what those problems are, and within the constraints, we are doing our best to alleviate them. They won't happen. They won't all get fixed overnight. We have to prioritize, and the priority right now is fixing the budget deficit. But there is a chipping away at all the other problems. And my sense is, if you come to India every 6 months, you will see significant progress on every one of these dimensions. So with that, I think that I've sort of given you a little bit of the philosophy behind the budget. Happy to answer questions.